Good morning. This is Sarwar Kashmeri, moderator for the Foreign Policy Association's opening panel at this year's annual World Leadership Forum from New York. The United States-China relationship is perhaps the most consequential of our time. It will likely set the course of the 21st century. Yet, the two superpowers are at daggers drawn, with increasingly hostile statements and lately fearsome weapons that are being displayed. Is there anything that can be done to reverse this, may I say, insane trajectory? The Foreign Policy Association has gathered some of the leading lights and deepest thinkers on this issue for our panel today, a group that it is my honor to moderate. May I remind you that the line for questions will be open during this panel, and you're welcome to fire away questions at the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Important to remember not to use the chat button, but the question and answer button. So let me just tell you what the flow of this panel will be like. After my very short introduction, I will let each panelist present opening remarks. I have some questions to ask them, which I will save till after all the remarks are made. And then after all of that, hopefully in conversation with the panelists, we'll have some questions from you. So please do look at that Q&A panel and ask questions. At the end of the session, it'll be roughly 50 to 55 minutes. I'll let each panelist make a closing remark, right? So it's about an hour. The time goes by fast, and I just want to take this opportunity to let all the panelists know that you have my deepest apologies if I interrupt you while you're speaking, because I just want to make sure that we complete the entire agenda during this hour, because it is difficult to get the people like you all at the same time from around the world. Okay, so forgive me for that, if it happens. So now let's get on to business. Let me introduce, first of all, Professor Min Yi from Boston University. She is the Associate Professor of International Relations at the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. Her research explores the nexus between domestic and global politics and the intersection of economics and security with a focus on China, India, and regional relations. She's the recipient of numerous grants and fellowships in the US and Asia. Then we have Professor Paul Evans from the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, the University of British Columbia. He is the HSBC Professor in Asian Research at the University of British Columbia. He has written extensively on US-China and Canada-China relations, as well as regional security affairs. He's now working on the role of universities in an era of deepening confrontation. And then again from China, we have Professor Michele Geraci. He is the Professor of Practice in Economic Policy, University of Nottingham, Ningbo, China. He was the former Under-Secretary of State at the Italian Ministry of Economics, mastermind behind the Belt and Road Initiative Memorandum of Understanding between Italy and China. He was an investment banker prior to that in New York and London. And forgive me, Michele Geraci, but I had to say this. He's very famous in China because when COVID-19 first hit central China's Wuhan, he made a banner that read, and I'll murder this Chinese sentence, Wo Shi Wan Ren, I am a Wuhan resident, which went over so well in China because he showed his support for the city. And then last but not least, I have Professor Zha Daojiong. And by the way, Professor Daojiong Mr. Michele Geraci come to us from China, and Mr. Paul Evans from British Columbia. So we are literally spanning the entire time zone of the world with this panel. So Professor Zha he's the professor of international political economy, Peking University. He's a consultant to the government People's Republic of China. He's an expert in Chinese energy policy and food and water in Asia. And he was recently named the inaugural Lowy Institute Rio Tinto China Analyst Fellow. So that is the very distinguished panel that we have with us today. And I will let them now make some opening remarks. And Min Yi, may we start with you, and then Paul Evans, and then Michele Geraci, and then finally Zha Daojiong. So Min, the floor is yours.
Good morning and good night. Perhaps a good day somewhere. We are crossing the global time zones here. Thank you so much to Sarwar for inviting me to join this distinguished panel, as well as the nice introduction. I really appreciate. So I want to share my ongoing reflections on U.S.-China competition, as I see that U.S.-China, in both U.S.-China, are experiencing unprecedented skepticism on globalization or interdependence, and there is an increasing acceptance or even preference for decoupling. And so in the US, many of you recall Foreign Affairs article titled Reckoning China, sweepingly argued that interdependence between US-China basically failed American interests, as well as a global agenda that America seeks to open to China or bring China into the global system. But similarly, in China, there has been an intense sense now called China paradox. So that idea is the more China opens itself and reforms itself, the worse the world or the West sees China. And the more China aids others and the less popular China's public image gets outside China. And so in China, there is unprecedented the disappointment or skepticism of interdependence as well. So there, and in the scholarly communities that I socialize with, and the discourses are equally pessimistic and basically taking away from the globalization's scholarship. So these include the Thucydides trap that focuses on structural power transition and the security tension because of the power transition. And then the clash of civilization that emphasize US-China's competing, very different and yet competing ideologies, norms, culture, behavior, institutions. And in China, I sense that there are counter arguments to these two dominant discourses, but the arguments tend to be divided apiece. That is by logic of power, interest, and Chinese culture, tradition that the two great powers, superpowers, have to exist but separately, respecting each other's core interests and existence. And I wonder whether that's really the case, that interdependence has been so bad that we have to pursue decoupling. In fact, the most recent security discourses in China and America is that a new Cold War is good, and this is a way to peace. So I want to challenge this assertion that a new Cold War might be a viable peace solution. And I research on the U.S.-China competition, great power competition in the last decade, right? And I focus on the process of Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Belt and Road Initiative, and the Free and Open Indo-Pacific Strategy, and how the domestic coalitions operate in driving, shaping these competing strategies from the U.S. and China. And what are the outcomes of those domestic coalitions activities? So I find that the interdependence has created the kinds of strategic environment that shapes the domestic coalition and the policy processes of great power competition in choosing TPP and shaping the BRI and shaping the free and open Indo-Pacific, or the Quad. And these are three mechanisms that, in my opinions, are mitigating mechanisms of great power competition. The first mechanism is what I call porous information, right? So each round, when the one great power presents a competitive strategy, and there are immense research conducted on its cost, benefits, strengths, and the weaknesses, and in the power, in the initiating power, as well as in the opponent powers, as well as a lot of middle powers, right? So the information on a particular strategy is well researched and well communicated, and overall, there is a strong desire to de-escalate when they see situations might get out of hand, and to make up for the shortcomings as those information comes to light. So the second mechanism is, I call it, it's a plural influence. Right? So great power typically is controlled by strategic and military actors prior to interdependence. But in this round, the pure military strategic-oriented strategy actually do not survive as a winning strategy domestically. So each time when a military-oriented strategy becomes salient and there's a pushback from social and economic and these kind of internationalizing coalitions. The third, I'll end here, that is globalization is not just about economic or trade investments. It's about globalized professionals, policy networks. So the think tanks, scholarly business associations, they are the professional intermediaries that communicate the information and the influence that I highlight about. So the 2020s decoupling, if this trend goes on, then I worry about the great power competition in the 2030s. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. And Paul Evans, your turn, please.
Well, good morning from Vancouver, and pleasure to be with you in an important meeting that brings together a lot of people. I'd like to build on Minye's very useful overview from, I would call it, a Canadian perspective. The US-China relationship is fundamental to not only the two countries, but to all of us, whether we are major powers, middle powers, or citizens of the world. And how we are going to navigate the rough waters that are being generated is crucial to Canada's foreign policy and how we're going to try to live in a turbulent world order. And speaking from Vancouver, we're breathing again. And I mean by that a little over a month ago, the solution to the problem of our two Michaels and Madame Meng Wanzhou, three M's problem, at least has been solved. They've gone home. Each side has their special citizens back with them. But Canada is in the midst of a very serious debate about what our China policy should be going forward. And I would say that the word competition is often used in the discussion, but so are the phrases coexistence and competition, but also what we can do in partnership and when we're going to have to counter China individually as a country or in collaboration with others. So the 4 C's are the foundation of our current government's policy, and it was just re-elected. But we're into turbulent waters, and the decoupling, the kinds of things that I think Minya talked about very seriously. If the political economy of the U.S.-China relationship really does move towards full or at least wide spectrum decoupling, we're in for a very rough ride that we're going to have to navigate. And let me talk about one institution that in the midst of this may be able to, it's going to be buffeted by the storm that we're in, but that it may be part of the long-term solution. And that's our universities. As we have looked at what has happened in universities and research, particularly in the science and biomedical fields in the United States, there are real causes for alarm. Partly because of the closing of doors, the closing of windows, and the attitude behind it, which I would describe as techno-nationalism. And this is the idea that the US-China confrontation is in several realms, but that one of the key features of it is that research, idea generation is increasingly being securitized. And that is to say that we've always been concerned about interactions with China or countries that we don't share their values and institutions. But in past, the restrictions on what we did as academics and others were really around military and dual-use technologies. What has happened in the United States in this new competition is that the fields that are seen as of national security importance have broadened dramatically from artificial intelligence through to biopharmacy. Not only are the fields that are seen as worrisome expanded, so is the definition. Competition in this new realm is not just around military technology. It is around the areas of work that contribute to economic advantage in the fourth industrial revolution. And so that now what has happened is that securitization of research in areas, biopharmacy, cancer research, a whole range of areas is now seen as risky because of China as a partner, but also dangerous because the competition, America is competing in a variety of sectors to maintain dominance. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that a lot of fields that were previously open to students, to faculty members to work on with Chinese partners, increasingly restricted. It means that student flows in particular areas are restricted. And I think here in Canada, as we looked at what has happened in the United States, Australia, in Canada and the United Kingdom, we're very concerned to try to keep as many doors open as possible, to try to focus on those areas that may be a real national security concern that need to be watched, but not with the broadest definition. And that going forward is the mission of our universities. If we have an antidote to some of that competition, it's going to be done through university exchanges and collaborations. Yes, certain fields have to be restricted, but we keep those fields as limited as possible to keep the door open as wide as possible. And there, Sarwar, I think, is the agenda, not just for our research, but how we organize ourselves.
Indeed. Thank you very much for that opening statement. And the floor, Michele Geraci, is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sarwar, for this opportunity. And also thanks to the United States, to our American friends for giving me so much during my career. I worked 25 years still now for US institution and NYU investment banks, and also thanks to China that's given me a new career and propelled me to a new government role. So in a way, I have to say thanks to both of them, and my role is now to make sure that those two great countries go back to a very prosperous relationship. It is true that China has a different model. We have different ideology system, but let's be direct. Who cares? I think every country can choose whatever system they like. As a former government member, I learned to respect what countries choose to do. It is not up to me to say what other people should do. And I think we should, in a way, highlight and cherish, in a way, this diversity. When we say China has different values from us, this is something I always hear in Europe, in the United States. But I never, first of all, I'm not sure what that means. I don't know if it is also true. Probably it's not even true. But on the other side, China never says the West has different value than ours in a antagonistic manner. They tend to say we have different values and we try to respect each other within our differences. So the approach is really different. We may have differences. Let's assume that is true. But the approach that we have is different. And I think this creates a little bit of worries on our Western frame of mind, because maybe we are worried that China wants to export this political system into our countries, into Europe, in the United States. My estimate, my guess, educated guess is this is not true. One, because it would not work. True. Second, because China knows that it would not work. And if I may, third, China would not export a model that they think it works. They would never hand it over to potential competitor, something that they believe has given them growth, prosperity, and social stability. So if we do believe that China is our competitor, then logically, we also need to be consistent and do not worry that China would not want to export to us something that works so well for them. I always say every country is both a competitor and a customer of each other. Italy is a competitor of France. France is also a customer of Italy. Italy competes with Germany. Italy competes with China. The US competes with China, but we are really integrated, and we need to really understand that we cannot emphasize the competitive aspect. First of all, it's not a good idea. China is not the USSR of 1970s. It's a different kind of animal. So when we talk about Cold War, we may need to redefine the meaning of Cold War. This is not the 50s, this is not the 60s, and China is not the Soviet Union. Decoupling that we want to try to do, I would say it is a double-edged sword, because the moment the West does export restriction or forces the decoupling, all it does is accelerate the development in China of domestic technologies, know-how. It happened with the International Space Station, with supercomputers, with artificial intelligence, and so on. And again, this is not the Soviet Union. This is China that has is a quarter, fifth of the world population, and soon the biggest economy in the world. So this idea of decoupling will just make China stronger, because it does reach exactly the goal that China has set for itself, that of dual circulation. And China has already decoupled. China used to have 30% of GDP coming from export. Now it's only 18%. And this has happened maybe without us knowing 20 years over the last 10 years. Finally, I think we have a positive angle here on climate. Just like 40 years ago, we had both a political and economic alignment in opening up and reforms. We had Reagan in the US, Thatcher in the United Kingdom, and Deng Xiaoping in China to move away from, let's say, socialist and move into market economies. I think now we also have another chance 40 years later with the climate, and infrastructure. Both the European Union with the recovery plan and the von der Leyen Green New Deal, Biden going back to the climate agenda, Xi Jinping promising different targets, 2060, 2050. We all want, the three main blocks want and can do this. And we can also do the infrastructure, the Belt and Road, build back a better world. It is not a race on who is better. Sarwar, you said I supported the Belt and Road. I'm a big fan. I'm also equally a big fan of the US-led BBB3. I hope it works. I'm a big fan of the European Recovery Fund. The world has 8 billion people. There is a space for everyone, and there is need for infrastructure in 6.4 billion people in Asia and Africa. So it is not a competition. It is not a race. There is room to do roads, bridges, energy, and infrastructure for the three main blocks that also have not only an economic interest to develop Central Asia and Africa and Latin America, but also an ethical one. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michele Geraci. What a wonderful way to start. May I now please turn the floor over to Zha Daojiong. All the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, and greetings from Beijing. I listened to the previous three colleagues, and several things struck in my mind. I'll come back to that a little bit later. I thought one way for me to get started is to mention that for many here in China, we look at the wonders of the Beijing-Zhangjiakou Railway that's going to connect the city, downtown Beijing, to the Winter Olympics facilities. 100 years after the first railway, which was built by Zhan Tianyu, who was a graduate from Yale University, that old railway laid the foundation for China's modernization, our embrace of science, and many would argue not necessarily the Western political system. But today, how come when China is able to deliver a driverless high-speed rail at 350 kilometers an hour safely, it has been in the running for 2 years actually, we get disliked or rejected that much, as me and others outlined earlier. And a particularly worrisome recent development is the undertone of racism behind the AUKUS, Australia, UK, and US alliance. This means the rejection of French not being Anglo-Saxon enough. It's also coupled with a downgrading of the Quad, because of Japan and India are not part of that kind of Anglo-Saxon. This is very concerning because, and it's specifically targeting what exactly is it in China that you need to have that kind of globalized nuclear network, that you need to really rewrite the codes of so-called new, you take the leadership to proliferate. This is not this is not a communist versus anything. It's not a culture thing. I mean, you can define this a different way. But then I don't actually feel that bad, or that does not really rile me up when you talk about, you know, coupling or decoupling, because it's very easy for many Americans, including my colleagues, who have webinars with us, say, well, we'll just take the best and brightest from China and keep them, right? Because these guys deserve to serve us, not China, not the despot communists. That's okay. We all live in real ecologies of life. And like I mentioned from at the beginning, China could not have developed without the benefits of science, technology, goodwill, human ingenuity that grew in the United States. And in spite of the Chinese exclusion of whatnot, years after years, America had its attraction. And also we have generation after generation of foreigners who come to China. If anything, China should become more open. So I'm not worried about those abstractions because many of those arguments, for example, engagement has been a total failure. What kind of arrogance? It's a total fallacy. A simple thing, you can be a good doctor, but without a patient, who proves you're a doctor? That arrogance of saying seemingly engagement is the one-way delivery of goodies to others. Now, that's not my problem. It's I may be too blunt in referring to some of these things. But what truly worries, earlier I talked about race. Another is this rhetorical poisoning that comes, you talk about misinformation, you talk about disinformation. Now you have governments, agencies, people who are elected or appointed to position of power, who spread such things as, Chinese companies collecting biological data of people around the world, and then engineer biological medicine to destroy other human race. These things come up in New York Times, a supposedly respected paper. Is it because America knows how to do it? If you don't know how to do it, if you're not doing it, how can you accuse others? You will use this word suspicion. Suspicion. If you don't know how to do it yourself, how can you suspect others? You really take the rest of the word as being dumb? I don't know what kind of diplomacy we're getting into. This is very worrisome. Last but not least, I mentioned one peculiar anecdote I read in the news report. It talked about one particular company that proclaims to be able to assess the geographical origin of cotton that have been woven into, a gene, the clothing of a gene, and say where it comes from, how far it's away from the ocean. Of course, this relates to Xinjiang and other matters. In other words, it's a very lively example of technology for the bad. You go, anyone who has some common sense about the textile industry will say it goes after so many processes. But then you have a company said, well, I have the technology, I can get the genetic data. So likewise, I share Paul's, among the other comments, I share Paul's concern about, the doors closing on universities, especially when it comes to the so-called sensitive technology or so-called national security. That's what eventually will help tear apart the fabric of human life, science, basic science.
Thank you, Professor Zha Daojiong. I actually now have a question for you, Zha Daojiong, and that was a really forceful, thoughtful opening remark that you made. I think I was, like all the other remarks, but I want to follow up. And my follow-up is this: the US side is increasingly proactive on the Taiwan sovereignty issue, right? Recently, even calling for Taiwan's entry into United Nations groupings, which is a huge red line for China. These moves are in sharp contrast to the friendly meetings in China with Wall Street CEOs, the US Treasury Secretary Yellen, National Security Advisor Sullivan, and US climate negotiator Kerry's calls and visit with his Chinese counterparts. So my question is this approach where good cop, bad cop, if in the American terminology, or friendly on one side, hostile, is this confusing to Chinese policymakers?
We discussed these topic just about every session of these conversations with American colleagues. I typically have 2 lines of answer, or 3. Technically, the mainland and Taiwan are still in civil war. And that says it. And secondly, if there is one thing that we see here as so-called rules-based international order, that's the Taiwan issue. Taiwan's status or whatnot that was voted in the UN, and then the settlement of the new order really began with the end of World War II. And many in the United States would talk about the end of the World War II at the beginning of a so-called new set of rule-based order. I don't quite, many of us here in China don't quite get it. How can you have that, convenient separation of the Taiwan issue from the so-called rules-based international order?
Right.
We're talking about sovereignty. Third, this is probably uncomfortable to some of our audience, especially those based in America, but I will say it anyways. Taiwan, so long has there is a previous precedent to look at. Should Taiwan function as Cuba did at one point of time between the Soviet Union and the United States, Taiwan will know what it will get. We have a good precedent, and we're getting closer to that.
Thank you very much. I'm going to come to you, Min Yi. And what I want to ask you is, you've heard this really direct statement from Zha Daojiong, and how do you respond to that? Because you're the more optimist amongst this group here, if I may say so. So give us some words of wisdom here.
I culturally, philosophically, I feel like I'm a Chinese. So we are both optimist and a pessimist. That's how we survive as a nation, as a people. So I actually agree with all 3 colleagues here, including Professor Zha Daojiong's remarks and his 3 lines of answers from China's perspective. I think that lines on Taiwan should be known more in the discussions on Taiwan here. And we have so many Taiwan forums, workshops that do not cover China's scholarly and the general middle classes, ruling classes. That's bigger than the military and than the leadership himself, and how they view about the Taiwan issue. And that's very clearly characterized by Professor Zha Daojiong, right? And I don't think these views are known enough by outsiders. So on this, I want to commend this forum that Sarwar, you are organizing with the Foreign Policies Association, that you actually bring in a genuine and mainstream views from China. And then we have colleagues that represent a wide array of opinions. And that, frankly, such forums are too few, just too few. And we look at YouTube, there's so many events, but frankly, the more hawkish and more singular views are dominating. So from that, I think this, if we can carry on these traditions of expanding the conversations here and actually taking in a lot of mainstream views from China, going beyond the POAF jets and the leadership's rhetoric, and that's the direction to go. But I do want to push Professor Zha Daojiong a bit more. That is, I think our as a university, as think tanks, as scholars, our goals are really, although there is a decoupling push, right, the competitive push, the confrontational push, but we have so many of us that are very eager to work, exchange, communicate with Chinese the think tankers, scholars, academia, and semi-officials, bureaucrats, that would be very useful. But I'm afraid that the China's domestic term is more significant than the U.S. Washington term. My question for Professor Zha Daojiong, and also my wish for Professor, is whether the Chinese academic, scholarly think tank, these communities can go broader and keep the vitality in global exchange and collaboration. Yeah.
So I'll come back to you, Zha Daojiong, in a moment, but I want to give Michele Geraci, I have a question, and then Paul, I'll come to you. Michele, you know, part of my preparation was for this panel I read an abbreviated version of Marco Polo's Journey to China from Italy. Yeah, and in the book they describe Venice, how it was during that time. Everything in the world was to be found there. It was a glowing city, ivory from Africa, ebony, you know, all kinds of spices. Everything was. Now we have, instead of one city, everything available everywhere in the world, thanks to globalization and trade and so on. How can it be that with all of this taking place, we are at daggers drawn? Very quickly, do you have some thoughts on that?
30 seconds. I think we in the West do not accept that a Marxist-Leninist economy does better than us. That's the reason.
Okay, well, couldn't get more precise. Couldn't get more precise than that.
Ideological. We would.
Sorry.
That it's an ideological. It's not maybe just about doing business. Just we would see as a failure of our open market driven economy if a state/Marxist economy does better than us.
And would it be correct that if I were to give you 30 more seconds, you would say that the Chinese are more accepting of American governance than America is theirs?
They do care less, because I think, if I may, in the morning with the cappuccino, the Chinese leadership does not worry about what happens in Washington. They worry how to feed 1.4 billion people and bringing them out of the middle income trap, give them prosperity, whatever beyond the slogan and the words. They do care of what we do outside of China, insofar as this affects their goal of develop their own economy. They are not in a competition.
And I'm going to jump to Paul Evans, and I'm going to talk about this really delicate issue of Canada trying to navigate between America and China. And of course, this is coming to a fore on the Taiwan issue. I noticed that increasingly Canadian analysts want Canada to stop being ambiguous and jump on the American bandwagon, which seems to be heading towards a more independent Taiwan. So Canada will soon have to make this decision, or will it?
Taiwan issue for Canada has been built into the DNA of the relationship with Beijing since 1970, when we made a shift to recognize the mainland. But I think, drawing on all of the comments on the panel, the mood, the atmosphere in North American and Western discussions is increasingly negative about China and the prospects of the kind of competition, cooperation that we wish to see happen. And as much as some of us as academics push back against some of those views, the mainstream is moving. And in the Canadian case, on Taiwan, we sent a frigate to join a US destroyer in the Strait of Taiwan 2 weeks ago. That's a small, but it's a signal of the pull towards some kind of confrontational approach. Our government has not changed its policy. It is not going to support Taiwan's entry into international organizations. And the reading here is that Mr. Biden misspoke himself on what he was actually promising. But we're caught. But the challenge is we're not just caught between, we're caught in a public that increasingly wants harder action against China, that wants to see us line up with the like-minded, with our allies, whether in the Anglosphere or broader democratic alliance. Those forces, those pulls are very strong. And it takes an intelligent government to come up with nuance and balance to ride through that storm of public demands. And I'm still optimistic that our Liberal government can do that. But one episode, one military clash in the South China Sea or in the Strait of the Taiwan, the impact it would have on the flow of opinion and the demands on our government would be enormous. For the moment, we're holding the line on moderation, emphasizing coexistence and cooperation, but that is hanging on it's on the razor's edge.
Wow, thank you for that. And I'm jumping back to Zha Daojiong. You know, and as an American, I hate to say this, but I used to be a big believer in bipartisanship, the different parties working together. And I'm starting myself to question whether total bipartisanship is really good for the United States. Because to my understanding and my knowledge, almost the entire China establishment in the United States is turning or has turned hostile to China. You can't get a word in sideways from any direction. And so my question to you is, how is the China establishment, the China-US establishment, feeling right now as this change has taken place in America? Is your establishment, the Chinese establishment, starting to become completely anti-American and hawkish? Field is yours, sir.
What do you mean by anti-China or anti-American? I think to my understanding, the so-called bipartisanship on the part of the United States on China is probably more a reflection of the divisiveness of domestic policy rather than China per se, including Marco Rubio, you know, Ted Cruz, these usual names. Do they really know China? How do they get informed about the bills? Who drafts those bills for them? I think those are more worthy questions than the seeming, the number of the votes. Now, as for the so-called America establishment here in China, I must say where there have been dramatic failure over the past 40 years for the legislatures of two countries to relate to each other. The entire Chinese legislature has virtually nobody who, you know, relates to any foreign country in any sense of the term. We're too limited to a few folks in the foreign ministry, and this, you know, you don't have the division of labor to share the risks of failing. And that drives our foreign policy, especially in rhetorical explanation, to the shoulders and a very, very narrow list of few. And they happen to turn to be, you know, to have a race with each other through that very narrow tunnel, a chimney of rhetorical competition among themselves, what you guys call warrior diplomacy overseas. And many of us, I myself certainly so, disagree with that. It does no service to China as a government or as a civilization, as a country, to have that kind of hawkishness, rhetorical hawkishness. But the end of the day, like I said, you know, we all live in a complex ecologies of culture, of human interactions, and frankly speaking, of material flows. I wouldn't be too, I'm not actually too anxious about the war talk or the talk of competition or confrontation. each society has its own water's edge. Yeah, including that with between China and the United States. And earlier, Paul mentioned about Canadian frigates going through the Taiwan Straits. It may not be a bad thing. It may actually be a beginning of Canada reviving some of its steel making industry. And I'm not joking. I'm not doing it in a sarcastic way. I'm not. Yeah, so it's not a bad thing. So long as the Canadian voters approve of, upgrading their boats and move up and down a few more seas a little more frequently.
So maybe we should buy and work with the Americans on nuclear-powered submarines for Canada, eh?
Assuming you pay the cost and operate it safely.
Too much defense spending.
Listen, I want to
with each submarine fleet, nuclear or not, if you want to have one that's operational on a 24-hour basis in the waters, you need 6 ready. It's extremely costly because most of the boats are sitting somewhere, getting refilled or replenished or getting fixed. It's very costly.
So let me ask Michele Geraci, Europe has always been, at least the way we look at it here in America, the voice of reason in many ways in these big conflicts, right? It seems to me the mood is changing there, that the European Union is starting to jump on board of the American wagon rather than challenge this growing daggers drawn. Am I reading this correctly, or you tell me?
No, you are correct. The mood in Europe has changed, and it has moved also into an anti-China narrative. And this is, of course, almost 90% of the media and many politicians. And I would say across the political spectrum, I see both in Brussels and in Italy, left wing to center, right wing, for different reasons. They all have taken on China for the simple reason that I think maybe Zha Daojiong was talking about. It's not that everyone really knows where China is in the map, but it is very convenient to have an enemy when we have social problem, COVID, economic recession, competition that we don't have a roadmap to fix. So the average politician in electoral democracies does need to find votes to survive. That's his job. It is not to serve the country. That comes after, because if you don't get votes, you don't get to serve anyone. So
I like that one.
Well, listen.
So there is a priority, like almost a pyramid of needs. They need to be satisfied first.
Oh, gosh. Well, Minyi, we are reaching the end of this dialogue now. Can you tie all this together? I was just making some notes, and I think maybe we need to start steel goes to Canada, and America gets high-speed rail. Tie all this together for us. Leave us with an optimistic note. We won't have time well, maybe we will. Go ahead. Tie this together for us. Leave us on an optimistic note.
So I guess now that I and Professor Zha Daojiong are in the same panel, I have to say that my earlier interactions with Professor Zha was in those a lot of track 2 networks relating to China-Japan conflict in the 2000s. And we forgot how bad it was between China and Japan from 2003 to 2006. And Professor Zha was really a core around the main track 2 dialoguers, and I'm representing the young leadership on the academics. And I have to say those years of track 2 were very fruitful. Exactly as I said, the scholarly communities, the think tanks, the business associations that have a strong stake in stability. We don't need to like each other. Between China and Japan, really not many people like each other, but all of us have such strong interest in stability, in avoiding an active conflict in the region, and those conversations, exchanges were fruitful. And so I think today, I hope we can reboot the East Asian model in the US-China competition.
Well, that's a wonderful, wonderful, positive way to end. We are running out of time. I want to take this opportunity before I thank this wonderful panel to thank Matthew Barbary and Magdara King from the FPA staff who put all this together and are watching behind the scenes to make sure it goes well. I particularly want to thank my friend Noel Lateef, the president and the CEO of the Foreign Policy Association, where I've been a fellow and associated with it for now almost 20 years. And I think you can see why I have this deep respect for the FPA. They allow panels like this to simply carry on, fearsome, fearless, whatever we want to say. And with that, I want to thank this great panel, Minyi, yourself, of course, Paul Evans, Zha Daojiong, Michele Geraci. Sorry to wake one of you up so early. Sorry to interrupt your dinner, Michele and Zha Daojiong. And with that, let me end this panel and say thank you very much. Fingers are crossed. We all feel better, I hope. Let's just keep working away at peace, prosperity, standards of living to these two great countries, the United States and China. So for
Rest
now,
assured, wake up another day, it will just be fine.
Okay, thank you, sir. Bye-bye now.
And with that, we will take a short break and we'll resume at 10:15 Eastern Time for the FPA medal presentation.
Good evening, everybody, and I would like to welcome all of you to this wonderful Leadership Forum dinner. And I would also like to take an opportunity to say a special thanks to the Foreign Policy Association for your extraordinary work in nonpartisan public education, providing information to the public, truthful, factual information about world affairs and other initiatives across the globe is extraordinary and so much needed. Now, I have the special privilege tonight to present the Foreign Policy Association Medal to a very special individual indeed, an individual with extraordinary achievements throughout his career. That is Dr. Tedros. As you all know, Dr. Tedros is the WHO Health Organization's Director General, a position he has held since mid-2017. And he is the first person to hold this position from WHO's African region. Now, just a little bit of more background about him. Born in Ethiopia, and he went abroad to college, and after graduating from the University of London with a master's and the University of Nottingham with a PhD, he goes back to Ethiopia, eventually becoming Minister of Health and Minister of Foreign Affairs. His primary focus has been and is health. And in Ethiopia, he led a transformation of their healthcare delivery system, improving access, evolving the financial reimbursement systems, enhancing the talent and the workforce of the organization, extraordinary work, so badly needed. And he had unbelievable results. Now, I could spend a lot of time talking about the wonderful outcomes, but just let me give you one. As a result of his endeavors, there was, over a period of time, a 60% reduction in child and infant mortality. Just think of that. It's an extraordinary achievement. And subsequently, he moved on to take on global leadership positions, focusing on important issues such as AIDS, malaria, TB, issues, of course, that confound many parts of the world that we need continuing solutions for. And his leadership skills have been abundantly evident in his new role since 2017 as the WHO's Director General. He put in place a 5-year strategic plan. That comprehensive plan focused on setting measurable goals, enhancing the operating structure, and inspiring a new culture of partnership, diversity, inclusiveness, obviously with the full understanding of the important role that WHO has in the world and needs to take in the world going forward. The task is large. Challenges are unbelievably complex, especially now, and as the Foreign Policy Association fully recognizes, leadership matters. Transformative, compassionate, dedicated leadership matters. So it is now my distinct honor and privilege to present the Foreign Policy Association's medal to Dr. Tedros, a scholar, a consummate diplomat, a resilient advocate, a world leader, a person with enormous responsibility, and a person who is unbelievably qualified to take on the role. So I know you all right now will be with me as I congratulate Dr. Tedros. How privileged we are indeed to have somebody of his skill, his character, to be leading the WHO at a time like this. His talents are needed and will be needed as we maneuver the very, very difficult challenges globally that we are all facing. And as a previous recipient of the medal, it is especially wonderful to have the opportunity to say to him a special, special congratulations. Thank you for everything you've done, for everything I know you are doing, and for everything we all know that you will do in the future. Congratulations again, and thank you.
Distinguished members of the Foreign Policy Association, dear colleagues and friends, I was deeply honored to hear that I was being awarded the FPA medal, and I'm truly sorry I can't join you in person. My sincere thanks to the Board of Directors of the Foreign Policy Association and to President Noel Latif for this honor and for the opportunity to offer some reflections today. The COVID-19 pandemic has destabilized societies, economies, and governments. It has shown that there is no global security without global health security. Almost 5 million people have lost their lives, and that's only from the disease itself. The real impact is far greater and will be long-lasting. The fastest and best way to end this pandemic is with genuine global cooperation on vaccine supply and access. This is the challenge of our time. More than 6.7 billion vaccine doses have now been administered globally, and almost 1/3 of the world's population is fully vaccinated against COVID-19. But those numbers mask a horrifying inequity. almost 75% of vaccines have gone to high and upper middle income countries. Low-income countries have received less than 0.5% of the world's vaccines. We are now facing a two-track pandemic fueled by vaccine inequity. Countries with fragile, conflict-affected, and vulnerable settings are especially at risk. The pandemic has taught us many painful lessons. One of the clearest is that we can only confront a common threat with a common response. That's why we must do everything in our power to meet the goal of vaccinating 40% of the population of all countries by the end of this year and 70% by mid-2022. But it's also true for the steps we must take to build a safer world. Let me lay out 4 key areas for action. First, we need better global governance that's inclusive, equitable, and accountable. The current global health security architecture is complex and fragmented, and voluntary mechanisms have not led to the coordinated and coherent global approach we need in the face of a global threat. We believe an international agreement or treaty on pandemic preparedness and response will provide a much-needed framework for global cooperation, setting the rules of the game and enhancing solidarity among nations. Second, we need more and better financing for national and global preparedness and response. Cycles of panic and neglect have created a financing ecosystem that's insufficient, inefficient, and inequitable. We need a substantial increase in domestic investment, including in primary health care and international financing to support low and lower middle income countries. Crucially, we believe any financing facilities must be built using existing financial institutions rather than creating new ones that further fragment the global health architecture. Third, we better systems and tools to prepare for, prevent, detect, and respond rapidly to outbreaks with epidemic and pandemic potential. Already, WHO has taken steps to start building some of those tools. Last month, we opened the WHO Hub for Pandemic and Epidemic Intelligence in Berlin, and several other initiatives are in development to improve the sharing of biological samples, to improve lifelong learning for health workers, and to enhance mutual trust and mutual accountability between countries. And fourth, we need a strengthened, empowered, and sustainably financed WHO at the center of the global health architecture. With 194 member states and 152 country offices, WHO has a unique global mandate, unique global reach, and unique global legitimacy. The pandemic has challenged the very core of multilateralism and the principles that underpin it. Today's complex global challenges, including the intertwined crisis of COVID-19 and climate change, require effective multilateral governance and solidarity-based international cooperation. In the 1960s, the US and the Soviet Union set aside their differences to work together eradication of smallpox. In the end, it was global solidarity that defeated smallpox, not just a global public health campaign. We need that same spirit now for the global challenges ahead. Thank you once again for this great honor, which I accept with a renewed commitment to do everything in my power to create a healthier, safer, fairer future for all the world's people. Again, I accept this great honor on behalf of my colleagues at WHO, whom I am proud of. I thank you.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome our Word from Wall Street moderator, Matthew Lizzetti, Chief U.S. Economist at Deutsche Bank, to get our panel started.
Thanks so much, and good morning, everybody. Welcome to our Word from Wall Street panel. I'm Matt Lizzetti, Chief U.S. Economist and Head of U.S. Economic Research at Deutsche Bank, and I'm honored to be joined by three distinguished panelists this morning to discuss the outlook for the U.S. economy and global economies, and in particular, what it means for global markets. It is no doubt a particularly interesting time to be having this panel with the global economy and U.S. economies being rocked by supply side shocks that we really haven't seen over the past several decades. And in particular, as markets, even as we speak, are going through a pretty remarkable repricing of central bank reaction functions over the next several years. So I'm excited to go through a lot of these topics today with our panelists. Joining me today are three panelists: Abby Joseph Cohen, President of the Global Markets Institute and Senior Investment Strategist at Goldman Sachs; Joyce Chang, the Global Head of Research and a member of the Management Committee for JP Morgan's Corporate and Investment Bank; and Mark Chandler, Managing Director and Chief Market Strategist at Bannockburn Global Forex. Thanks so much to all of you for joining us today. So just to get a sense before we get started in terms of the structure of the panel, we're going to have a discussion for 45, 50 minutes or so on kind of all these topics related to global economics and global markets. And we're going to aim to leave some time at the end of the call for Q&A from the audience. And throughout the event, if you do have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box down at the bottom. I'll be monitoring that, and we can bring them into the discussion as it fits in. But in terms of kicking off, I think the area to start and the area that has been of most focus for global markets and global economics and economists has been on inflation. And I'd like to start with that topic. Inflation rates have clearly risen globally. US headline CPI is running above 5%. Core inflation in the US for CPI is running around 4%. It's about the highest in 3 decades. And there's obviously a very lively debate out there about the sources of this inflation shock, supply versus demand driven, and how long will it last? Is it temporary, to use this word that central banks may be pushing to the side at the moment now, or is it a more persistent or permanent shock? So Joyce, I'd like to maybe start with you and hope that you can kind of kick us off here in assessing this inflation shock. So how much credence are you attaching to more temporary sources like supply chain bottlenecks? And as a result, how long do you expect this inflation shock to last?
Well, thank you so much for the question. And it's great to be here with Abby and with Mark. Well, higher inflation is here to stay. And while some of this is transitory, I would call it persistently transitory and persistently overshooting. And I think the risks are to the upside here, even though we have core inflation running globally at north of 4%. And I want to just highlight some of the risks that we see on the supply chain side, the demand side, and also talk about higher oil prices, housing market as well, and wage inflation. So first of all, just saying that this is a supply chain shock is an incomplete answer. First of all, every supply chain is really dislocated for a different reason, and that raises the possibility that the disruptions won't be easily or quickly remedied. And the other thing that we have seen is that the supply chain shocks have hit in different ways. So we saw first, when you look at transportation, that it was air freight was the big problem. Then it moved to seaborne freight, and now to domestic distribution when you look at the trucking sector. And this underscores why much of this is when we entered the pandemic and how we're exiting in the lockdowns. But looking at the inputs where we see severe shortages happening globally, semiconductors, transportation, lumber, we've actually seen increased volumes and production since the pandemic. So the bigger issue here really does go to the demand side. It's the demand produced by the combination of the lockdowns emerging from them, the stimulus measures, the higher savings rates, and the higher disposable income as well. And this really points to some of the issues ahead, is that there was just not preparation for an acceleration of demand, not just at the household and the corporate level, but also at the government level. And the regional Fed governments, regional Fed governors really saw this first, and so did the corporates. They saw that we were not ready for the demand. But we have some other aspects of inflation to worry about, global oil prices. So we have global oil prices, up 12% in the fourth quarter of the year. That implies nearly a 2.5 percentage point increase to CPI inflation. And if you actually did scenarios of in oil at $100, you really double that impact. I think the other issue we're looking at is rent inflation. Housing services are about 1/3 of CPI and about 10 to 15% of PCE inflation. And we do see here that globally housing prices are at a 40-year high, up 17% in the US. And finally, there's wage inflation. We're seeing bargaining power going back to the workers, and that shortages are continuing in certain areas. So even though there are some transitory elements, we're not going to exit at the same time. And the services inflation, I think, will be more of an issue, with risk to the upside also because of higher oil prices.
Thanks. I think that really lays down the groundwork really well, especially how we had something which seemed to be initially a supply side shock, which could morph into something more persistent. I would note that we've, in our own team, have highlighted inflation expectations just being very sensitive to oil price movements. And so we've noted that market measures and survey measures are likely to continue to move higher given the movement higher in oil prices. And that could be another channel through which this becomes a more persistent shock. Abby, I'd like to turn to you. The latest inflation data have raised questions, I think, about how we should think about the interactions between asset classes and how do you kind of construct a portfolio in this world of more persistent inflation pressures, if you believe that to be the case. And please also feel free to give your view on the inflation data here. For example, the 60-40 portfolio has been called into questions if bonds are not as good of a hedge against downside risks. And so one, how are you viewing the inflation data, either similarly or different than Joyce? And then two, have your views on asset allocation changed at all in light of recent inflation developments? Oh, I think you're on mute, Abby.
You would think after 20 months of this, I would learn to take myself off of mute. So my apologies to everyone. There was so much in Joyce's response. I'd like to unpack a little bit of it just to give you a sense of how that, I believe, affects asset allocation. First of all, I agree wholeheartedly that inflation was beginning to rise pre-pandemic. And many of the factors which Joyce laid out so well has, of course, exacerbated that. Some of it may abate, but that doesn't mean that there aren't some underlying factors as well, including the rise in wages, which, as we know, are so critical in terms of whether an inflation surge has some longevity. I also think it's important to recognize that there will be a difference between CPI inflation and PCE inflation. Those of us who dig into the statistics can tell you why that is, basically different weights for some important factors, including shelter, including consumer durables such as autos. There's also going to be a fill-up to inflation on the CPI side because of health insurance premia over the next few months. So some of that will calm down, but that doesn't mean that we're not on an upward inflationary path. And Joyce was absolutely correct to mention what's happening in commodity prices and so on. You ask, however, about 60-40 and asset allocation. And I have to say that the most recent inflation data has not really changed my view on asset allocation, because I have taken the point of view that bonds have been overpriced for an extended period of time. This didn't just start this week or this month. In fact, if we look at valuation models for bonds, just the way we have valuation models for equities, there has been not one single major bond market that we felt was priced appropriately. In fact, I would say the following, for those of you who are really Fed watchers, you know about R-star. R-star is the Fed's way and the market's way of looking at what we consider to be a neutral short-term interest rate. And R-star is below the historical average of the real policy rate. And when I say historical average, I'm going back decades. However, everywhere it's above the current market pricing. Let me state it differently. What every central bank believes, maybe with one exception, is that current real interest rates are just too low. And so from that standpoint, when we think about asset allocation, I've taken the point of view that bonds have not been an attractive asset. And here I'm talking about plain vanilla. Obviously, there have been some opportunities in terms of various forms of bank credit and so on. So let's spend just a moment on central bank policy before I give you one more look at asset allocation. When we look at what central bankers have said in recent months about what they plan to do, tapering, raising rates, and so on, the presumption has been, and this is true for most central banks, is that the tapering will end before the interest rate increases begin. That seems to be sort of a natural thing where you just want to end one form of accommodation before you start tightening with another policy tool. But there are some exceptions. And one of the critical exceptions is the Bank of England, the BOE having announced that it expects to be raising rates before the tapering is over. And we have to recognize that we are now at a point in the market, in my view, where we're going to see differences in the way central banks approach things. Why? Because the so-called liftoff rate for different economies is different. Liftoff rate meaning, how is the economy doing? There are some that are doing well. We're looking at the UK, for example, 7% real GDP growth this year, an estimated 5 to 5.5% in 2022. You can understand why the BOE might be looking to raise rates more quickly than some of the other central banks, even at a time they've not finished tapering because they don't want to disrupt the markets by tapering too quickly. So that's one aspect of it. But here's another thing to keep in mind. There's only one central bank where their staff currently estimates that R-star, that is the neutral policy rate, is still negative. Think about this for a moment, right? There are lots of banks, lots of bond markets out there with negative real yields. There's only one where the central bank staff thinks it should be negative, and that's the ECB. And in combination, that's a pretty large economy. Does the Fed believe, the Fed staff believe that R-star in the US is negative? Absolutely not. Something more on along the lines of 0.5 percentage point. So let me sum this up and then very briefly asset allocation. We are now at the point where we're going to be seeing more notable and quicker changes, I believe, in central bank policy. Yes, tapering, but also everyone looking toward potential increases in rates. Now, for the US, my colleagues in the economics department believe that won't happen most likely until, let's call it mid-year 2022. But everybody is saying it is fact dependent. They'll be watching at that very important inflation data that Joyce spoke about so well, but also what's happening in terms of GDP data. That to me is important. Asset allocation, 60-40. 60-40 has been mythical for many years now. Anybody who has been watching the news, for example, about college endowment reports over the last couple of weeks, we see that any number of colleges and universities have reported results for the last year in excess of 40%. That didn't happen with a 60-40 blend. It happened by incorporating alternative assets such as private equity and venture capital into the mix. And as somebody who spends a lot of time speaking to those who have those responsibilities with asset allocation, I will tell you that 40% weighting in bonds hasn't been in effect for a very long time. The kind of weightings that I've been seeing in fixed income writ large have been well under 20%, in some cases almost close to zero, unless there has been, again, a movement into bond substitutes, but not really plain vanilla fixed income. What we have instead seen has been an opportunity and a desire to move into things that could generate other returns, not so dependent upon the bond market. So what will happen to institutional portfolios, endowment portfolios, and so on, as inflation perhaps calms down a little bit, but as interest rates moves higher? I don't think that's where the pain is going to be. I'm much more concerned about individual investors who don't understand, quite frankly, a lot of them, bond arithmetic. They don't understand that when interest rates go up, the price of a bond goes down. I find that worrisome. And I find it even more worrisome when you look at the flows of funds that have gone into bond mutual funds, because individuals have a very difficult time understanding that even if they don't sell their share in a bond mutual fund, if somebody else has done so, as interest rates begin to rise and the NAV begins to decline, they don't understand that that other shareholder has locked in potential losses for them. So when I think about where the pain may be in terms of investors as interest rates move somewhat higher, I think it's going to be much more individuals than institutional portfolios. And in case anybody is wondering, I'm not expecting interest rates to skyrocket. I think they will be moving up. They're moving up from very, very, very low levels. By the way, that's a Stan Fisher expression. Very, very, very low interest rates. I think we'll be moving to very, very low interest rates, and it'll take a while before we get back to anything that we think of as being normalized interest rates.
Thanks so much for that, Abby. And some of these topics on growth and central banks will hopefully get into in a little bit more detail. And you raised what I think has been some of the most interesting market dynamics recently, which have been reducing expectations for the terminal rate for central bank pricing, flattening yield curves that have happened in response to this move. And so hopefully we can talk about that as well. Mark, I'd like to bring you in, and you've spent your career immersed in global currency markets. So I still want to stay with the inflation topic here if possible. And what are the implications of potentially higher trend inflation on FX for you? And really, could this be the development that wakes up greater volatility in FX?
Yeah, thanks. Maybe I could just talk more directly about inflation, because I think my views differ a little bit from Abby and Joyce's. First, both cited in higher energy prices, and of course, we see them at the gas pump, we see them to heat our houses, and yet I'm struck by the fact that the last 3 business downturns in the U.S. were preceded by a doubling of the price of oil. So I want to say oil is a special type of commodity. And it's really not, I would not view it as inflationary, though it does get picked up in the CPI measures and the PCE measures. But at the end of the day, I think it's ultimately deflationary. Remember when the ECB back in 2008, oil prices were near $150 a barrel or so, and the ECB raised rates twice because of the inflationary threat, just as the economies were headed for, at the time, the biggest downturn, I think, in a generation. Second thing I'd say, just about leaving aside the oil component, I think that this wage component, I hear of people, businesses that I talk to as well, they're worried about wages. And that's what it's as if it's the one equation, the one factor in the equation. And to me, what we need to do is think about it in terms of productivity. As we sit here today, the US is about 5 million jobs shy of where it was at the end of 2019. And yet the economy is bigger. This is productivity. And one way we measure this is unit labor costs. And unit labor costs in the US actually fell in the first half of the year. And we see this, another way we're seeing this is this incredible earnings season that we're in the middle of. So you've got higher energy prices, we've got higher wage costs, and yet these corporations, S&P 500, are reporting spectacular earnings for the most part. And so I think we want to like be careful here and not just, for a long time, I think wages were low. So we talk about living wages and benefits to the to people who often get the short end of the stick. And now we've got this perhaps longer term, but at least immediately, there's some greater negotiation power. And all of a sudden we need to jump up and down and worry about inflation. I say, no, hold on a little bit, because we are working harder. And not only are we working harder, but what businesses have done is, for the existing workers, they're working a longer work week than they were at the end of 2019. So combine these things, I say, let's be careful about getting too excited about inflation, because just like inflation might be, the jargon is what, temporary inflation or transitory. Well, that's what growth is going to be. Fiscal policies being removed, leaving aside what the central banks do, the market is tightening financial conditions for them. So I think that by the middle of next year, we're going to see lower prices and slower growth. And the last thing I just say with this is about what's actually already happening. In Q2, the annualized pace of core CPI in the US was near 10%. So we take the look at the Q2 core CPI, and just to annualize it, just to get a running rate, 10%. In Q3 that we just finished, we just got the data, 2.4%. So I think that by the time, it's sort of like, maybe for me, I'm getting older, my eyes aren't as good as they used to be. When I go running along the ocean, by the time I can see a dolphin out of the water, it's already headed back in. And I sort of wonder if that's not true about the CPI and inflation. Of course, it's very fashionable to worry about it. It is coming in at 20-year highs or 15-year highs. But the part of inflation that I worry about the most is the structural kind that you were talking about that is before the pandemic. Things like the reversal of globalization, the demographic issues, aging population, and what that means for the life-saving cycle. I worry about those kinds of things as the underlying basis for inflation. But these other things, I think, are generated by base effects, supply chains, and the reopening of the economy in an unprecedented way, in a very disjointed way. The extended supply chains make it more complicated for the reopening, as we're seeing. But again, generally speaking, I think that there's a couple of countries that don't have inflation problems right now. Japan, if you exclude fresh food and energy, they're looking at minus 0.5% for their CPI. And many people talk about China exporting inflation, but China's CPI itself is less than 1%. So I think, to Abby's point, that countries will have different reaction functions, but they also have different experiences with that inflation. And so countries like Switzerland, countries like Japan, and perhaps even the Eurozone lag behind, whether it's Norway and New Zealand have already raised rates. I think Abby's point is spot on, that the UK is talking about raising rates. The market's thinking it can happen next week. And the US, the market looks to me like as soon as the Fed gets done with its tapering, which they say in the middle of next year, it looks to me like the Fed funds futures is pricing in a 25 basis point rate hike for July next year.
Thanks so much. I think you raise a number of great points. One being the supply side shock that is happening, and should central banks be responding to that? What does it mean for growth in particular? On the structural forces, it is at least a topic that we've been focused on a lot within our own research recently, and trying to quantify those things, netting out deglobalization and aging and perhaps climate change policies versus Amazonization and those types of things. And on net, at least on our reading, it does seem like that's going to be a bit of a trend boost to inflation going forward. But I'd like to maybe shift focus a little bit to, and we've talked about it a little bit on the growth side, but the other side of this supply side shock, which is, we know that it has clearly lifted prices. The question is on the growth side, where we are seeing some growth disappointments and at least more popular discussions about stagflation type dynamics. And so I'd like to get your thoughts on that side of the coin, on the growth side. And maybe Joyce, we'll start with you. The US economy has been unique, I think, in the magnitude and persistence of the fiscal response that we've seen to the pandemic. However, we just learned this morning that the economy grew only 2% annualized in Q3, something very much consistent with pre-pandemic type dynamics, but the slowest pace since the pandemic hit. And do you think growth concerns are overstated in the US? Or do you think this morning's data is a sign of a little bit more persistent growth disappointments to come?
No, thank you so much, Matt. And maybe I just add a few comments onto what Mark and Abby had to say. Well, first of all, I'm in complete agreement with Abby that the 60-40 has been mythical for a long time. And we are recommending much more of a 2020 60 formula, adding in more hybrids and fixed income that has equity type returns. And that includes looking at high yield and fallen angels, REITs, even Chinese government bonds, and diversifying. And just on the inflation side, I use the expression persistently transitory because transitory to me, connotes that everything goes back to what it was before. And I do think, what we're looking at is where could you see some behavioral changes? And that comes back to some of the labor market issues. I mean, will you see more job hopping? Will you see a different labor force participation rate? All of these are things that we're watching very closely. And I agree that a lot of the energy issues are transitory, but they still can be, a shock. And I do think that we're probably in a higher oil price regime for a number of structural reasons. A lot of that related to the chronic underinvestment in CapEx that we've had in the large oil companies. But let me get to your growth question. So we're really seeing a multi-speed recovery in the third quarter. You had China contract 3.3% sequentially, the US at 2%, Europe at 8.5%. But I think stagflation is an over-exaggeration. I mean, looking at where we're at with global growth right now, I mean, we're not in low growth. We're still at above, potential, 3.4%, in an annualized rate. So this is not stagflation. But I think that it's, a step back from what a lot of people were hoping for the recovery a few months ago. And I think looking at the third quarter numbers, that kind of leaves global growth around 2.7% from full recovery. Now, I think that on the positive side, what we have seen is at the household and at the corporate level, we're in a very different place than we were during other crises. When we look at the households, we're still about 50% above in household cash levels, and there's still more stimulus that's coming online in the US, even if it has been watered down a bit. And looking at the corporate balance sheet as well, when we look at where interest payments are at, we're at some of the lowest ratios that we've seen in 40 years. So very different than what we've seen during other recessions. Household and corporates in a much better place, and we see global growth, still, having, a decent outlook for next year. So I think the stagflation fears are ones that are exaggerated, but I would say that I see some of the key risks coming from China. Every 1 percentage point decline in China's growth takes about 0.5% off of global growth. And we've taken the China growth forecast down next year to 4.9%. Emerging markets at large also are in a very different place. We talked about different starting points, but if we take a look at emerging markets, we're taking 0.5% off the potential growth. And if we talk about the inflation story in emerging markets, almost all emerging market central banks are going to be raising rates by the end of the year outside of Asia, and half of them are going to be raising rates by more than 75 basis points in the next 2 quarters. So we are seeing different pressures playing out, a very uneven recovery here. But China, is what I think concerns me the most with respect to the global growth outlook, because so much of the world is dependent on China demand. And for a lot of the commodity exporting countries in Latin America, the correlation for growth when China drops a percentage point, it's practically 1-to-1. So I think you could still see a story of US exceptionalism, continuing in 2022, but I'm more concerned, on a China slowdown over the medium term and the impact that will have, particularly on the emerging markets economies. So I think that, we have an uneven recovery that still has momentum into next year, but watch the China risk.
Thanks so much. I maybe have 2 follow-up questions to that, Joyce. One, you did bring up additional fiscal stimulus and infrastructure. So I was hoping maybe you could just give us your view on where these negotiations end up. Certainly any given day, it looks a bit different, but we now see what it has. It seems like a $1.75 trillion framework, and would like to know where you think that ends up. And then maybe 2, is the spillover from China deceleration to, say, US growth less in the current environment where it is mostly a service-oriented recovery in the US, for example, where we need to get service spending, domestically oriented spending recovering? Is the US less sensitive to China growth slowdown in that world?
Yeah, the U.S. is definitely less sensitive to a China growth slowdown. So if it takes about 1% off of China, takes about 0.5% off of global growth. We think that the U.S. correlation is less sensitive. It's more like 0.2. So it is very different for the emerging markets countries, and Europe, which is more trade dependent, it's more like 0.5%. But just going to where we are on the stimulus package. So I think I think this will go through and budget reconciliation before the end of the year. It could be closer to the holidays rather than early in December. And they're still trying very much to get the bipartisan infrastructure package through before you head into these elections just in the coming days, the gubernatorial elections. And I think that the 1.75 is sort of well below the 3.5 trillion that had been hoped for, but I don't think you're necessarily going to get the pay-fors through that they've proposed. So they've proposed almost $2 trillion of pay-fors. A lot of that is on tax evasion measures and enforcement by the IRS, which really requires a lot of take-up. I mean, if you look at the proposals, I mean, you have to first of all expand the size of the IRS by 2/3, and then actually collect the taxes. So I think that the headline 1.75 trillion going through, I see that happening before the end of the year. But on the other side of it, how they will have the revenue measures through, I think that's much more of a question mark, since they've taken out the individual and the corporate tax raises. And so a lot of the things that are in that seem to me like they're going to be hard to come to fruition quickly. They will take a number of years. There's a number of components that need to be put into place given the numbers that they've put out on enforcement for this. But I think you will get this through. I think Democrats understand this is sort of do or die for them as far as getting both the infrastructure and the overall bill through. So they have now finally come to that compromise, but you may still see this drag into December before you actually get all of the votes and the details down. And I think on the tax revenue side, it's going to be a shortfall off of what they have announced.
Yeah, we were certainly surprised to see the increases for the corporate tax rate dropped and the top individual income tax rate dropped. Mark, maybe I'll come over to you. And Joyce did flag China, I think, as a concern from a global growth perspective. And I know you spend a lot of your time focusing on that economy. And that's been at the recent center of recent concerns and risks related to credit and the property sector. So I'd like to get your broad thoughts on global growth and specifically on slowing growth in China. Is that an area that you're worried about?
Yeah, so thanks, global growth. Yeah, I mean, I think that we're past the peak. I mean, US probably peaked in Q2. It looks maybe Europe, Eurozone maybe peaked in Q2 or Q3. But I think a year from now, we're going to be looking at 3% growth in our rearview mirror. And I think that for me, that's part of the inflation story too. We're going to have slower growth, partly because what's fueled a lot of this growth is fiscal stimulus. Joyce mentioned about the surplus that we have on the household balance sheets and corporate balance sheets. And I say, of course, we should have a surplus there because we got big deficits in the government sector. I think that some of the Chinese slowdown is intentional. For example, they cut back on steel production to reduce their greenhouse emissions. And so I'm not trying to argue that China's turned these back China bonds as green investments. I'm just saying that part of the slowdown is purposeful. And when it got too much, I think we're seeing China relax some of that. I think that our problems, that is the growth challenge that we have in the US, is sustaining aggregate demand. I don't want to blame on Beijing. I want to blame on Washington. I don't want to blame the slowdown that Europe is having or will have on Beijing either. I think that the challenge we have, I think, with China is that we don't think that China plays by the rules. And I think that this is a view that's shared not only on Wall Street, but globally, as far as I can tell, so we got the economy side, but you also have the politicians. And I think I think that two things happened that has really shifted the broad perspective towards China. One was several years ago when President Xi the Communist Party of China, passed rules to allow him to be president for life. I think that we can get used to a bad leader because we know they're going to be out of office. We could the system can outlive them. I think that was a turning point. I don't think that the US was duped into believing China was going to become like us. I think the opening up of China was done, the engagement with China in the late 70s was done not to, I think it had very little to do with trying to turn China into a US, but really as a counterbalance towards the Soviet Union. And secondly, I think that the other shift that China did that I think has alienated potential friends and allies is its behavior in the South China Sea, the intimidation, the bullying, whether it's Taiwan, Philippines, Malaysia. I think it was last weekend, Russia and China had some military exercises and they surrounded Japan. And so I think that it's for me, this is one of the, it's not so much economics per se, but I think that there's a big arms race and it's only going to get worse going ahead. I think it was last night that the Taiwanese president acknowledged that there were US troops in Taiwan training. And I know in my experience, there's three types of trainers that the US has. The real trainers, the trainers that were in Vietnam that turned out to be combatants, and then the trainers we have, like the troops, say, in Germany, that don't really, they're really there not because they can stop Russian invasion, but because they act as a tripwire. And a week ago or so, I think it was last Friday, that President Biden said that the US would defend Taiwan. And this was seen to be a break from the strategic ambiguity principle the US has had for a generation. And of course, the White House walked it back. But it's these little overtures, and you say something, you walk it back, and well, what's the real thing there? What's the real meaning? I think that what Ronald Reagan said about the US deficit after he cut taxes and increased spending, he said the budget was big enough to take care of itself. And I think the same thing about China, that the Communist parties claim to legitimacy rests on them being able to deliver the goods to the people. And I think we're wrestling with similar issues, the power of the internet companies, the concentration of wealth and power, making sure that the people who have been disadvantaged by this during periods of strong growth have policies that are aimed to improve their lot. You know, the Chinese are able to have an 8-fold increase in per capita income from roughly 1980 to roughly 2010 or something like that. And I think that's slowing down. Partly it's slowing down for good reasons. A lot of the impetus for the growth, moving people from the country to the city, that's run its course more or less. The technological gap between China and the rest of the world. And China closed that gap the same way that other countries who have been below the, have been at the short end of the gap have closed it, partly by hard work and partly by stealing. And I think that this is true whether it's the US in our early days of industrialization or China in the 21st century or the 20th century. These are, doesn't sound very moral and ethical. I know it's like off the high ground, but this is the way countries operate. And I see China having done as much as it can in that space to close that gap. So now it's got to be going forward much more about their own inspiration and perspiration.
Thank you for that, Mark. Abby, maybe if we can conclude thinking about growth, if you have any additional thoughts on the growth side of whether it's specifically to the US or global growth, and do you believe concerns about stagflation on that front are maybe overblown, or are they real?
So let me follow up with Mark's comments, because it's a great segue to think about long-term economic prospects. When you think about the challenge that China presents, yes, some of it's on the military front, including in space, where whoever has the highest satellites wins, because they can control an awful lot from up there. But the other big challenge to us has been the failure of the United States, in my view, to do as well as we used to do in terms of making long-term investments. Now, there's been so much discussion about the soft infrastructure plan. I have nothing else to add there other than to say we're not doing what we used to do. in terms of providing educational opportunity. We're not doing what we used to do in terms of providing vocational training and so on. But there's another category in which China has presented a direct challenge, and that has to do with the actual money spent for things like basic research and R&D. If you go back 20 years, the United States was without a doubt the world's leader. And China was, I have to say, kind of nowheresville, either in terms of money spent or what we would refer to as intensity, that is money spent as a percentage of GDP. If you look at that measure, the United States, going back to the end of the 19th century, was always number one. We began to invest very heavily during the Civil War in terms of higher education. We began to invest during the Civil War in the Transcontinental Railroad. And by the First World War, the United States had gone from what used to be referred to as a third world country to number one. In so many regards, we spent more than anybody else in terms of basic research, and as a percentage of our economy, we were heads and shoulders above every other nation. And when we take a look at why the US did so well in the post-World War II environment, I would point to some of these economic factors as a critical reason. Where are we now? We've gone from number one to number 8. Think about that. We've gone from number 1 to number 8 in terms of how much we have spent for basic research and R&D as a percentage of our economy. Now, the reason for looking at it as a ratio is it gives you a sense of how much we could afford to spend. We're still spending more than other countries, but the gap has narrowed dramatically. China has come from nowhere to a very close number 2. And they are investing very heavily in these categories. And it's something that I worry about in terms of how the US economy will be doing long term. And while many people like to view that as a competition, it's also a competition with ourselves. How are we doing in these categories versus ourselves just 10 or 15 years ago? And the numbers are not particularly impressive. So I am quite concerned about that. Other nations, including some smaller nations, have stepped up in terms of having business models for future growth in which they're investing heavily in things like higher education, vocational training, and also their own spending on basic research, working on those categories where their nations excel. The United States hasn't really done a lot of that in a very thoughtful manner. We do it haphazardly. You know, there are some tax benefits that go to the energy industry. There's some tax benefits that go to some other industries and so on, but there isn't really a comprehensive, thoughtful planning process, and that worries me. Now, comments were made before about the infrastructure plan, how much might actually get passed by the Congress. I did some research over the last year or so with a terrific young associate of mine. And basically what engineers are saying, okay, so this is the Society of Civil Engineers, are saying that the United States currently has a $4.5 trillion deficit in our spending on hard infrastructure, roads, bridges, and so on in disrepair, $4.5 trillion. So when we take a look at the original $1 trillion, that was the hard infrastructure, and now whatever this soft infrastructure program turns out to be, it is still a fraction of what the engineers are telling us we need to do. So I would like to put it in that perspective as well. So I'm happy to address some of those other issues that you raised just a moment ago, but I'd like to stop here and see what else you'd like me to follow up on.
That's a great longer term perspective, I think, on kind of the growth challenges that we face here in the US and some of the sources of that, I think.
Yeah, and if I can add one more thing,
sure.
And that is the demographic challenge. I was delighted to see that, I believe it was the New York Times that just over the last week wrote about how dependent the United States is on immigrant labor. This is nothing new. You can go back to the 18th century, of course, and you can see how dependent we have been on immigrant labor, both, I have to say, those who came here freely and those who did not come here freely. But even within the 20th century, so much of the growth of the United States was related to incoming. If we take a look at Nobel Prize winners in the United States, more than half in recent decades have either been immigrants or children of immigrants. If we take a look at the growth in the number of workers in the United States, 60% of the net increase over the last decade has been immigrants. And one of the damaging things that has happened, of course, in recent years has been we've been discouraging those workers. Now, the first to complain were many of the large farms, including the farms in California, who said they couldn't get workers and crops were rotting in the fields. But our work also shows that we're highly dependent, of course, upon highly educated immigrants. So for example, a very substantial share of our new doctors in the United States are immigrants. Something on the order of 70% of the people who have PhDs in the United States in the sciences and applied engineering and are working here are immigrants. And to make immigrants feel unwelcome does an enormous disservice to our own country and has terrible implications for future growth of the US.
Thank you so much for that. I'd like to maybe shift here a little bit for the last topic. We have 15 minutes or so left on the panel. I'd encourage audience members to ask any questions in the Q&A, and we can also try to address those. But maybe for the next 10 minutes or so, we can dig in a little bit deeper on the central bank front. It's a topic that has been touched here and there, but it certainly seems to be at the epicenter of market repricing that we're seeing today. Certainly comments from the ECB this morning with their meeting. The Bank of Canada earlier this week sent off a big repricing with some more hawkish sounding comments. In Australia, we've seen front-end yields moving up briskly as the market seems to challenge the yield curve control policies there. So there is a market challenge to central bank reaction functions on that seems to be at the epicenter of what's happening with markets right now. And so, Mark, maybe I'll start with you. And I think you did mention this, but I'd like you to maybe comment a little bit more in depth on it. And we've seen a lot of emerging markets raise rates so far this year. Yet among the high income countries, it's been much less limited, much more limited. So Norway, New Zealand have hiked, and perhaps we get the Bank of England hiking next week as the market expects. But why exactly are we seeing this divergence?
And it's kind of interesting having that emerging markets. I think yesterday Brazil hiked rates by 150 basis points and promised to do another 150 next month. And that's after past couple months of hiking rates 100 basis points. Russia's been very aggressive about raising rates. Mexico has joined. But so it's primarily, I'd say, Eastern Central Europe, excluding Poland and Turkey for different reasons, and Latin America. East Asia has been a bit slower, but South Korea has moved already too. I think there's a couple of factors that help influence why developing countries or emerging market countries move first. Partly, they typically have, they basically run hotter. That is, they typically have higher inflation earlier on in their business cycle. Secondly, think about where we're coming from. Many of those countries, because of the pandemic, had lowered their policy rate below the rate of inflation. And that was okay for a little bit during the heart of an emergency. But as we get out of that emergency, it's hard to justify why a country like Brazil, for example, can have a negative real interest rate. So that's the nominal rate adjusted for inflation. Many countries in emerging markets, including Brazil, still have negative real rates. That adjustment has to go on. But there's something else that let the US, for example, have a negative real rate as well, and Europe as well. And I think that is the couple of factors about institutional strength, credibility, goodwill that's built up over time. We talk about a anti-inflation credibility, which comes from being able to react quickly and decisively to inflation threats in the past. And I think it builds up this goodwill that maybe we draw on a little bit during these kinds of times. But I also think it's a bit like that butterfly that lives for a day and lands on a big, powerful oak tree and thinks the oak tree is dead. Just a little bit too soon. I would think of it as a big cycle, like a big curve. and some of the emerging markets on the front of that curve, New Zealand and Norway, in the high income countries. But I think they're also going to see, and this is, I think, to your point, the central banks are saying they're trying to relax. There's not big a problem. They're slowly changing their commentary. Even Chairman Powell talked about the persistence of price pressures. Treasury Secretary Yellen talked about that these price pressures could continue into the middle of next year. Maybe that's the persistence of this transitory inflation that Joyce was talking about. But I think that it's just a question of like a temporal lag for the high income countries because they can. But I think that the markets are sort of forcing them to respond quicker.
Thank you for that. And we've certainly seen a little bit more reluctance to use the transitory or temporary word. It seemed like from Lagarde this morning and perhaps from the Fed next week. We think they may remove that from the statement. Joyce, maybe focusing specifically on the Fed. We have their meeting next week. Expectations have really reset for the Fed in terms of rate increases. The first full rate hike price around the middle of next year. And there's a lot of uncertainty clearly on the inflation and economic front, but also from a compositional perspective. At this point, we don't know whether Chair Powell will be reappointed or whether or not there'll be somebody else leading the Fed. There's an empty board seat. Vice Chair Clarida will likely be gone, perhaps Vice Chair Quarles. So a lot of turnover, a lot of uncertainty there. So is the market pricing appropriate at this point, given all of these uncertainties, or do you have a different view?
Well, we had one of our flagship conferences around the IMF World Bank meetings, and we did a client survey, and 70% think that the Fed will raise rates, next year, with about a quarter of those saying it's the first half of the year, and the remainder saying it's in the second half of the year. About 20% think it's 2023, but the market has really moved forward the pricing, and I think the Fed will still want to have a break between the end of tapering and when they raise rates. I think that they will try to remain as patient as possible, but I mean, just taking into account what Mark talked about and happening in emerging markets. I mean, look, by the time the Fed even starts doing something, Brazil will have raised rates probably 700 to 800 basis points. So we're not looking at coming out of this in any synchronized way this time. When we've seen past cycles, we've often seen something that's been very synchronized with what the Fed is doing. And this time we have a very uneven multi-speed recovery coming out at different points, supply shocks that some of them are going to be persistent, some of them are going to be not as persistent. So I think that, the pressure is on them that they're behind the curve. And I think it goes back to the diagnostic of flexible average inflation targeting. That was designed to address deficits in demand, right? Not increases in aggregate demand. And this is sort of the dilemma that they're struggling with right now. So I think that the market could push this, but when you look at what's happening around the world as well, but the composition, I think, that's coming in will be more dovish. I mean, the Biden administration has talked about wanting to have a government that looks more like the rest of America. So you have to expect that you're going to probably have appointments that are on the more dovish side. So they could wait. The question is, will the market actually price something differently than what the signals are from the Fed? And we also see differences within the Fed. I mean, the Fed regional governors have been more hawkish than the board, because they have seen at the corporate level, the corporates and the regional governors really saw this first. They saw the demand components coming in and that the supply chain just wasn't ready for this. So I think that there will remain pressure from the marketplace to look at this differently, irrespective of what the communication is. I think there's probably will be more dovish appointments, but I do see, when you see just the pace at which emerging markets are having to raise rates, and that's because I think, as Mark said, emerging markets have a history of higher inflation, shorter and more volatile cycles, and they don't have the fiscal space. And even though some of them have done asset purchases, they don't have the bandwidth to do this in the same way the developed countries have. Just looking at the scale of the asset purchases by the developed countries, I mean, you went from 30% of GDP on the balance sheet to 60% of GDP on the balance sheet post-pandemic. So I think that this it could be. I think rates are going to remain low in the U.S. I don't see them going up that quickly, but I do see more volatility, ahead, just given the different points in the cycle we're at with central banks around the world.
Yeah, and importantly, potentially some tension in the Fed, some more dovish appointments, but regional Fed voters next year that are rolling on are actually quite hawkish with Mester and George and Bullard and the Boston Fed presidency. So you have a voting bloc from the regional Feds that we think very much so believes that they're going to raise rates next year. Maybe Abby, we will conclude with you in this section. We have about 7 minutes left on the panel. But how do you think about this divergence that we've been talking about from central banks? And how do we think about asset allocation in that type of an environment? Is it creating some tensions, opportunities? How exactly would you think about it?
It's creating both tensions and opportunities. I would make one point, and that is the dollar is the world's reserve currency, right? And that does give policymakers in the US more flexibility in terms of how they wish to approach things. There still seems to be strong demand for US dollar and for US fixed income securities from the Treasury. So we do see basically variability in valuation around the world. I spend more time looking at equity markets than I do fixed income markets. And when I look at the equity markets, we are concerned in our analysis, not just on the interest rate outlook, but obviously the growth outlook. We're looking at the earnings outlook and valuation. Valuation matters a great deal. And our sense is that some of these smaller markets, in fact, offer some very good values at this point. But there's some nervousness on the part of investors in terms of going in. So for example, most valuation metrics show that the Chinese market right now is attractively priced, but there's such nervousness about some of the political trends that were mentioned earlier in this panel. What will the government do with regard to some of the technology companies there? What will they do in terms of some of the sectors of the Chinese economy that may be over-levered at this point? So what we see most investors doing is taking a wait and see approach towards China. There seems to be continued concern about Europe. While the valuations there look somewhat better than they do for the United States, the idea is also that they're growing more slowly. And the corporate sector in Europe is one where one has to do some picking. And maybe that really is the measure. I mean, I could do the world tour, but we have limited time. So I would say that what we're suggesting at this point is it's no longer a beta game. That is, it's no longer a game of being in a market. It's really an alpha game because we see enormous divergences in valuation. Now, we pointed out some market to market, but even within the US market, we are seeing one of the largest gaps ever. For example, between the highest decile PE stocks and the lowest decile PE stocks in terms of the range that spread in PE ratios. And so we do see that investors will be using this particular earnings season in particular to get a sense of whether their bets on the very high growth names make sense. Why does that happen now? Because if you have a fabulously supportive interest rate environment, i.e. very low interest rates and rates that you expect to stay very low for a long period of time, you're willing to pay a great deal for future earnings growth. But if you think that interest rates will be rising somewhat, even not very much, but just rising, then all of a sudden the calculus, the mathematics behind equity valuation changes a little bit, and you're not quite so willing to pay so much for earnings, especially if the most recent earnings report says maybe the earnings that you expected to be so reliable are a little bit less reliable. Where is the loss of reliability coming from? Some of it has to do with the supply chain problems that we referenced earlier in the session, particularly with regard to semiconductors, but also some of the other industrial materials, number one. Number two, some of the delivery issues and the distribution issues creating some concern about what the profit picture may be. And the third one has to do with whether companies can pass through their increased costs. Now, the presumption that I'm making is that underlying inflation, not the special factors that are really ginning up the inflation numbers now, but the underlying inflation is rising slowly, maybe even steadily, but slowly. And the question is whether companies can pass those increases along to consumers and to other customers, intermediate customers. So far, it would appear that they can. But if there is some evidence that they cannot, that then also becomes a problem in terms of where investors want to be positioned within the equity market. And one final comment, if I may. Joyce spoke very well earlier about stagflation, and I'd just like to remind people that the current environment is nothing like the 1970s, right? In the 1970s, when inflation began to rise, we had built-in measures in the US economy that made sure that inflation was going to become ever more problematic. Now, people like to point to the unions saying, they had their collective bargaining agreements and they had cost of living adjustments. Yeah, that's true. And also union workers represented a larger percentage of total labor then than now. But it wasn't just the unions. There were so many contracts that were written within industry that basically guaranteed companies that their increased costs would be covered. And when that's the case, no one is particularly careful about keeping costs under control. And so we had not just inflation rising for whatever the impetus might have been, perhaps it was the energy embargo and some other factors, but there was nothing really pushing back against it. Inflation became incredibly problematic. And then Paul Volcker, of course, stomped on the brake. So I don't see that what we're dealing with now in the United States is anywhere close to the situation of the 1970s.
Thank you so much. I think that's a great place to leave off. We're now at the noon hour, have had a great 1 hour. Thank you so much, Joyce, Abby, Mark, for your insights joining us today. Really enjoyed it, and I'm sure the audience did as well. So thank you so much, and everybody, please have a great day.
Thank you. Good luck to everybody.